Hi, my name is Sam Adams. I am the Orchestra Director at Montgomery County High School, Mapleton Elementary School, and Northview Elementary School in Mount Sterling, Kentucky. Now that Curtis has talked a little bit about the big picture stuff and some best practices that you can use in your classrooms, I'm going to focus in on a few areas I think most people feel unprepared for if they have to teach them coming out of college. The main areas are piano, guitar, and orchestral strings. Now, my main thing whenever I teach anything new or learn something new is to apply what you know. So no matter what you're going to teach, there's always something you know that can relate to something you're trying to teach. For example, if you're a singer and you have to teach band, you already know about posture, you already know about breath control. Use that. That's a good place to start. If you're a trombone player and you need to teach strings, you already know some of those positions are hard to find out there for beginners. You can relate that to trying to find those shifting positions on cellos and basses. I've kind of structured my presentation as almost a question and answer. So I'm going to post a question and then my answers to what the questions would be to try to help you guys get some ideas of things you can use or things you might already know that might translate to other instruments. So let's get started. Alright, let's start off with piano. Now, piano is my favorite instrument to teach, especially for anybody who's wanting to get into music for the first time, doesn't know where to start, because anything you want to learn on any other instrument will be easier if you know a little bit about piano. Now, as you probably know by now, the musical alphabet starts on A and goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then starts over again at A. I'm going to start on C, because in piano, C is kind of the easiest thing to start with. So if you want to find any C on the piano, you start with the black keys. Okay? So we have groups of 2 black keys here, then we have a group of 3 black keys here. So if we're going to find C, find the group of 2 black keys, and then slide your finger to the white key to the left of that. These are all C's. For teachers, or for anybody looking to use piano as a tool to teach other instruments, it's important to know that from one note to each consecutive note is a half step apart. Now once you get C, from C up or down is all white keys, and that's in the same scale. All the white keys up to the next C or down to the C before are all one scale. And the reason I like piano so much for teachers or kids as they're first starting out or trying to learn different instruments is because you can see physically where everything is, even more than you can on guitar. So on piano, let's get back to C. We have a C here. As you go up, we're going to call this chromatically, which just means you don't skip any notes in between. You go consecutive notes, whether that's black key or white key, doesn't matter. So we're going to start on C. We're going to go up chromatically to the black key next to it. That's one half step. Go up another one. That's a whole step. Go up another one. That's a minor third, major third, perfect fourth, tritone, fifth, minor sixth, major sixth, minor seventh, major seventh, octave. So you can see all the intervals that we have in music right there within an octave. And also, this is easy for kids to learn because all they have to do is push a button and the sound comes out. So they don't have to worry about embouchures, they don't have to worry about bow holds, anything like that, finger positions at first. I also use this with high school kids a lot whenever I teach them about music theory, because they need to know where certain things are, and I use this as a guide. For example, I have a piano up there by my podium that I use occasionally for theory stuff, and I put a picture of it up on the screen so that they can see this and I can point to how far apart the notes are. Because if you can physically see that from here to here is a major seventh and is really far apart, that's helpful to a lot of kids because they can see that distance. Whereas if they know that a minor second is really close together, that helps them to be able to see it, to visualize it. Alright, so next up let's talk about guitars. So guitars are basically come in 3 kinds. There's this kind, that's the acoustic guitar, there's the electric guitar, and there's the classical guitar. We'll start with the acoustic guitar, which is the one you'll come in contact with most often. The acoustic guitar has steel strings. The sound itself comes from the strings vibrating through the body of the instrument. The air with the vibration comes out of the sound hole, which is right down here. The parts of the guitars are all the same no matter what kind you have, but with the exception of a little bit on the electric guitar I'll show you in a second. You have the headstock up here, tuning pegs on the back, you have the neck, the nut right here, this white part. The dark part on the front is called the fretboard. All these metal wires going across this way, up and down, are frets. These of course are the strings. You have the shoulders, you have the sides, or you might call them the bout if you're more familiar with the orchestral instruments. This black part right here is the pick guard. Down here we have the bridge and saddle, and the saddle is the white part right here. The bridge is the wooden part. These posts just hold the strings in, and on the end we have the end pin. The basic way any guitar works, and this is the same for any string instrument, as you make the strings smaller, the notes go higher. So we'll talk about the open strings first. So for example, on the acoustic guitar I have in front of me, the open strings from low to high, and by low I mean low pitch, not low physically on the instrument. That's one thing a lot of people when they first start will get confused. When I say low on the guitar, it's actually kind of upside down from what you would think of because you're looking at it from the low side on top. So the low side is your thickest string, which we call the number 6 string, and it goes backwards. So 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So 1 is your thinnest one, 6 is your thickest one. And from low to high, there's a phrase I use for students to help remember it. It's Eddie, 8, Dynamite, Goodbye, Eddie. So the string names are E, A, D, G, B, E. We have 2 E strings, top and bottom, so they're octaves. So for the guitar, you can see the string length goes between the nut and the saddle. It's only this long. So between the 2 white lines you can see. As we put fingers down, say this is the lowest note, an E, by itself. As we put fingers down, only this much of the string is vibrating between our finger and the saddle. One thing I want to make sure that I mention about guitar is that, just like the piano, it works in terms of half steps. If we think about it being a horizontal instrument, so one that moves left to right or right to left, we have E on the open string. Put first finger on the first fret, which is the first little box. We have E sharp or F natural. Then F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B sharp, which is C natural, C sharp, D sharp, and then back to E. And so when we get to the 12th fret, the 12th fret is an octave. Most guitars will have dots somewhere on the instrument, and those tell the guitar player where their fingers are in relation to how long the neck is. If you're familiar with piano, which we just talked about, the piano goes kind of from left to right or right to left. There's not really any other way you can do it. On guitar, we have a little bit different options. So we can go this way on the strings, horizontally, or vertically on the strings, which confuses a lot of people at first. So it helps to know that on the guitar, for the most part, your 5th fret note is the same as the next note higher open. So for example, if I put my finger down the 5th fret on the lowest string, the low E string, and then play my open A string, they match. Same thing with the next string, the next one. Now the next one, you have to put your finger on the 4th fret instead of the 5th fret. And then back to the 5th. And that's actually a way a lot of guitar players tune to make sure their instrument's in tune with itself. One thing you want to make sure you know about before you even start playing is the position of the guitar. A lot of people will have the guitars down like this, kind of sitting on their knee, which kind of works for the most part, except it makes your hand, your left hand, that's going to be your fretting hand, really, really low, so that when you try to reach across to do things on the lower strings, or the lower pitch strings, it makes it a little more difficult to reach. So a better way to hold the guitar, is more of a classical guitar actually hold, is to keep it up like this. The tuning pegs up here should be right about ear level. So you can see they're right about even with my ear. And this brings your hand up so you can reach everything. And you don't have to try to worry about reaching or making any weird motions like this. Before you start playing, you also want to make sure you have some kind of pick. So here's a regular pick. It's just a little piece of plastic. And there's actually a machine called a pick punch that you can get. And you can punch these out of old credit cards or old gift cards, anything like that. It's like a big stapler with a pick shape at the end. I often use a thumb pick, which looks like this. So it has a little loop that wraps around my thumb. But the other side of it, there are different kinds, but this one, the other side of it looks just like a pick. And that way I can move my hands around, especially if I'm teaching. I can move my hands around, I can show other things, I can hold the guitar a little bit differently, and I don't have to worry about where I'm going to put my pick. A lot of guitar players will just stick their pick in their mouth while they're doing something with their hands. Right now especially, that is not a good idea, so make sure that you tell your students, if you have any students using picks, always, if you're going to leave the pick somewhere, set it down somewhere where you know where it is, or put it in your pocket. You may have some students who want to play with their fingers. That's okay, but it will wear their fingers out pretty quick, and they'll start to get some blisters on their fingers, and it might make them stop playing if they feel like they're hurting themselves. This is a classical guitar. It has all the same parts you can see, and there are a few things that are a little different about it. The neck on this one is a little bit shorter. The headstock looks a little bit different. The tuning pegs are on the side, and the strings go into the headstock a little bit differently. These are actually nylon strings. These highest 3 strings are just nylon. The lower 3 strings are nylon, but they've got some metal wrapped around them a little bit to keep them a little bit stronger. But it sounds a little bit more mellow than the regular acoustic guitar, the steel string guitar. And the neck is a little bit wider because traditionally you play classical guitar with your fingers instead of a pick. So you have to be able to get your fingers in between the strings to be able to play it. So this may not be the ideal choice for very young kids if they can't reach across and get the finger position because the neck is a little bit wider. But the strings are a lot better for younger kids because they don't hurt their fingers as much. And lastly, we have the electric guitar. All the parts again are pretty much the same, but you'll notice there's no sound hole down here at the bottom because for the electric guitar, all the sound comes out through these pickups. So the pickups down here are basically just wire that's wrapped around some metal magnetic posts that stick under the strings. And the strings, when they vibrate, upset the magnetic field, and it goes through a cord into whatever you're using to hear it or record it, like an amplifier or a mixer, anything like that that's going to produce the sound. So if you were going to start a guitar program at a school, the best option would probably be to get some acoustic classical guitars, because the strings are the easiest on the kids' fingers. You can get them in different sizes, and you don't have to plug them into anything like you would an electric guitar. Alright, so let's talk about a few things you can do on day one. The easiest way to start out with kids on guitar is to teach them tabs. Now, different people have different opinions on this. Some people, if they're especially in the classical style, want to teach them how to read notes right away, and I think that's a great idea. I've tried it both ways. Generally, they pick it up a little bit faster, especially younger kids, if you start with tabs. And so let me show you a picture of a tab here. So basically on a tab, it looks very similar to sheet music, but you have the 6 lines instead of 5 because each line represents one string on the guitar. The highest line is the thinnest string on the guitar. The lowest line on the paper is the thickest string on the guitar. And generally, if you're reading tab music like you would sheet music, it'll have a number on the line. The number that's on each line tells you which fret to hold down. So if it's a 3 on the top line, for example, you put a finger in the 3rd fret, in the 3rd box. If you want to see guitar chords, it's basically just tab music turned sideways. So the line all the way on the left is your thickest string, the line all the way on the right is your thinnest string. Here are a few easy chords to get you started. They're 1-finger chords. These are chords I always do the first day of class. So if you just ignore the bottom 3 strings for a second, the low 3 strings, we're just going to look at the high 3 strings. If you just strum those, that is an E minor chord. So with no fingers down at all, that's an E minor chord. If you put one finger down, doesn't really matter which one for this exercise, put one finger down on the 3rd fret on the highest string, the thinnest string, so in the 3rd box, and you want to try to put your fingers close to the fret wires, so close to these metal wires going across this way when you can. Not so much right in the middle, it helps them be a little bit more in tune that way. So put your finger right in that box, on the 3rd box, 3rd fret, and strum the top 3 strings again. That's a G chord, G major. If you flip it a little bit and put your finger in the 1st box on the highest string, that's a G7 chord. If you put your finger in the 1st fret of the 2nd string and strum the top 3 strings, that's a C chord. Alright, now let's talk a little bit about the orchestral strings. So it's very similar to the way the guitar works. Up here, this is not called the headstock, but this area is called the scroll. You have the tuners or tuning pegs on the side. You still have the neck. You still have the fingerboard. We don't call it a fretboard on these because we don't have any frets on the orchestral strings. They're just fingerboards where we put our fingers. You still have the nut right here. This one is black. You can't see it very well, but we still have it right here. Come all the way down with the strings. You have the bridge, which is this part right here. Fine tuner is right here, and this is a viola. So viola, violin, and cello have these. Bass don't have fine tuners. We have the chin rest right here. We have the tailpiece. These right here are called the F holes because they're shaped like cursive Fs. We have the shoulders. We have the bouts on the side. We have the back, and also on the back we have a shoulder rest. And the shoulder rest does not always come with the instrument. So if you've got kids starting off from the very beginning, you want to make sure they get a shoulder rest from somewhere, or give them one if you have extra ones around your program. So shoulder rests are really important. They hold the instrument up off their shoulder so they're not craning their neck like this or doing anything weird. It makes it a little bit more comfortable, a little bit easier to reach. Down on the end we have the end pin down here. On cellos and basses, the end pin actually has a little screw you can loosen up and pull the end pin out so it can adjust the height because they sit on the ground. So you can adjust the height for however tall or short the kid is. You always want to make sure that they're holding on their left shoulder, even if they're left-handed. You want to make sure they're sitting up straight, both feet are flat on the floor, which is the same for most instruments, so that's pretty standard. Make sure their elbow is under the instrument right here. I always have the kids start out, and most books have the kids start out using open strings, so they can hold their left hand right here on the shoulder to help keep it up. If they're trying to do this right off the bat, their arm's going to feel really heavy, and they're going to have trouble holding it up. So I always have them hold it right here on the shoulder. Plus, if we stop playing for a second, they can just set it down like this in what we call rest position. If they are using their fingers on the left hand, you want to make sure their wrist is straight. You don't want this to happen. We call this pizza wrist sometimes, or pancake wrist, because it's like you're holding a pizza at a pizza place. You don't want that to happen, because if that happens, first of all, it's hard to reach with your fingers because your palm is against it, just like it was with the guitar. But also, when you go to shift into higher positions later on, you can only go that far before you get stuck on your wrist. So if you bring your wrist down and make it straight, they can move all the way up here without too much problem. So make sure they keep the straight wrist, keep all their fingers curved. I tell them it's like velociraptor hands, like the dinosaurs. So you want to have their fingers curved, on the strings. You want to keep the thumb pretty much on. I always tell them this little line right here. There's a line between where the wood of the instrument of the neck and the fingerboard is. You can see that little line right here. I always tell them to make sure the fat part of their thumb is right on that line. That's an easy thing for them visually to see and to be able to move around with. When you play a stringed instrument with your finger, which is the way I would recommend starting and most books start, you want to pluck, which is called pizzicato, or they might abbreviate it P-I-Z-Z. You reach around, put your thumb on the corner of the fingerboard closest to the bridge. Reach across with your first finger, and that's the one you pluck the strings with. Now when you pluck, you do not want to pull up, because if they do that, they can pop a string or they can pull out a tune, that kind of stuff. You want to pull across. So you're pulling on the string, and as your finger comes across, it releases the string and rests on the next string. I always make sure I tell my kids right away that we are not going to mess with the tuners. So we're not going to mess with the big tuners. We're not going to mess with the fine tuners. All that stuff is stuff that I'm going to do for them. Even virtually, I have not had them mess with the tuners very much at all. When it got to the point where I hadn't seen them in a long time and we had to tune something, I only had them use the fine tuners. If there was a bigger adjustment than that needed to be made, I said, don't worry about it. I'll get it whenever I see you next. If you need to adjust something on here, in order to make it tighter, you have to push in as you tighten it up. Otherwise, it'll just twist backwards and fall out of tune again. So for each string, we have a letter name assigned to it. This is a viola, so the strings are a little bit different than a violin, if you're more familiar with that. But the good thing about viola, and the reason I use one a lot during class, is because the string names on a viola are the same string names on a cello. So if you know this one, you know 2 instruments right off the bat. The low string, I almost always go from low to high whenever I teach strings. So the low string is on the viola and cello is C. The next one up is G. The next one up is D. And the highest one is A. On a violin, they're set up the same way except everything's shifted down. So on the violin, the lowest string is a G. The next one is a D. Then an A is right here. And then E, a high E is on top. And so you'll need to make sure you know that violins and violas use the same fingerings as far as what their left hand is doing. But violas are shifted down 1 string lower. They have 1 extra low string. The violins have 1 higher string the viola doesn't have. Most books do not start using the bow until several pages in, which is good. Start with your fingers plucking first, so they get a feel for how to put their left hand down on the strings. They get a feel for where the strings are. When you do start using the bow, a few things to know. This is a viola bow. You can see it's a little bit curved right here, and that's what you want. You want it to be a little bit curved even when it's tight. If it's all the way straight, if this stick is completely straight, that means it's too tight, and it can snap the string, or the bow hair. It can snap the tip off down here. It can pull it out. There's a lot of bad things it can do. So you want to make sure the stick is a little bit curved. The hair underneath the stick should be just tight enough to where if you set it down on something with no pressure, it should not be able to touch the stick just with the force of gravity. You also want to make sure on your right hand, when you're talking about the bow hold, you always have them make a curved thumb on the back, and I tell them that it's like your thumb is like a shelf right here, the tip of your thumb, and you just want to take the bow right next to the frog, so not through this gap right here, not the gap, but right on the edge of that frog, little notch. You want to take it right here and set it on their shelf, on your thumb. And if the edge of your thumb touches the bow hair right here, while you're doing that, it's okay. So I always tell them, take their thumb, set it on the shelf, then wrap their other fingers right around it. And everything should be nice and curved, nice and relaxed. Your pinky should also be curved, which is hard for little kids to do because their pinkies are short and they want to do this and just hammer it on there to make sure that they can really push down with their pinky. But make sure they hold it with their left hand, hold all the weight up, curve all their fingers. Their middle finger should be pretty much right across from their thumb. When you start to use the bow on the instrument, you want to make sure that you keep the bow straight as you pull it, which means your right wrist is going to have to bend a little bit as you get further out. And you can explain all that to the kids and show it to them. But just make sure your bow stays within this little gap right here between the end of the fingerboard and the bridge. And as you pull it, your bow stays straight. One tip I like to use, whenever you're starting with the bow, and I think most books probably recommend this too, start on the rosin. In the Essential Elements book, they call these rosin wraps. So you basically are just playing rhythms, but you're playing them on the rosin. I usually go back to the beginning of the book when I start the bow instead of starting it where the book says, because they've already heard these songs and they know how to play them. They know what they sound like a little bit in their ears. They know the rhythms already. So they're not having to think about all that. The only thing they're adding that's new is the bow itself. So I usually go back to the first few pages of the book when we start the bow. But first, go on the rosin, hold the rosin straight, and have them practice their bow hold, get a good bow hold, and practice pulling straight across the rosin. I always make sure to tell them to line up their bow with the sides of the rosin because they can see that. It doesn't take a lot of rosin. It just takes enough to where you've got some stickiness on the strings. I usually tell the kids to do it 5 or 6 times. because typically if we're going to start using the bow early in that class, we're going to be on the rosin anyway. And so the more we play on the rosin with these rosin wraps and things like that and these exercises, they're going to get rosin on the bow anyway. Now some kids have a really hard time understanding that as you put fingers down, the note changes. So what I like to do a lot of times is show them a mandolin, because mandolins are the same size as a violin, pretty much the same size as a viola. They're also tuned the same way as a violin, but the advantage here is that they have boxes. They have the frets, just like the guitar we talked about earlier. So mandolin has 8 strings. We call those courses of strings because each set of 2, each pair, is tuned to the same pitch. So we have 2 Gs, 2 Ds, 2 As, and 2 Es. If you don't have access to a mandolin, you can use a guitar, but I show the kids this whenever I can because as you put fingers down, they can see the fingers going into a box. And if they can see the box, that makes them realize, oh, that means my fingers have to go in this specific place to make that specific note. And you can still play along with them if you have a mandolin. You can play along with all their songs out of the violin book because all the notes are the same. Also, with high school kids, I show them mandolin sometimes because the frets get smaller as you move higher up. So this is a great way to show them that for high school kids because they're going to start shifting up the neck to some higher notes. They need to realize that their fingers have to be closer together up here. So hopefully this is giving you some ideas and some things you can try out in your own classroom. Here's some other resources in case you need them. You can always find me on either email or social media, and I'll be glad to help you out any way I can if you have any more questions.